Okay, think about this for a second. Every Saturday night in Bogota, Colombia, you've got 18,000 young people gathering for worship.
18,000. That's huge.
Right. And it's not just a one-off. Week after week, something like 500 of them make a personal commitment to Christian values.
Wow. That statistic alone, it really challenges the common picture many people might have of religion in Latin America.
It absolutely does. We often talk about Latin America in terms of history or politics, maybe economics, but this points to something else entirely, doesn't it? This really vibrant, dynamic faith life happening in certain places.
Exactly, and that's what we're really digging into today. We've pulled together some fascinating sources that look at how Christian movements are growing across the region.
And the situations are just so different. I mean, you've got these massive stadium gatherings like in Bogota.
Yeah, but then also significant growth happening, really quietly within isolated communities.
And even in places where, well, expressing faith openly is difficult because of government pressure.
Right. So our aim in this deep dive is to explore these different scenarios. We want to try to understand what's really driving this growth.
What makes these movements work? What helps them thrive in, let's be honest, often really challenging circumstances?
We're looking for those kind of core ideas, those aha moments about community, resilience, and maybe the unexpected things that fuel change.
Okay, so let's jump right in with something that feels a bit like a paradox.
Okay.
We know Latin America actually has a huge number of Protestant missionaries, right?
Yeah.
More than anywhere else in the world.
Yeah, the numbers are quite high. Something like 15,000 foreign missionaries in countries like Brazil, Mexico, Ecuador, Peru alone.
And then you add on all the short-term volunteer groups, mostly from North America, heading down there wanting to help out.
It's a lot of external effort, a lot of resources flowing in, which leads to this really critical question that our sources raise.
Which is?
Well, with all this missionary presence, why aren't we seeing more widespread, self-sustaining church planting movements or CPMs across Latin America?
Exactly. It seems like you'd expect more, organic growth springing up everywhere. And this is where it gets really, really interesting. It seems that the very aid coming from North America, however well-intentioned,
might have had an unintended consequence.
Right. Some surveys in Latin America found that in certain areas, maybe up to 90% of the actual church buildings were put up by volunteers from the U.S.
90%. That's staggering. And think about the perception that creates locally.
Yeah, what does that do?
Well, it seems to have fostered this idea among local believers that you need that external financial help to start a church.
Yeah.
Practitioners involved in trying to start these movements, they'd hear it all the time.
Yeah.
You encourage local Christians to start a new church, and the response is often, well, how can we? We don't have the American funding.
So the building itself becomes this hurdle, even a simple one.
Exactly. Even a modest structure, by U.S. standards, feels like this huge financial barrier that local Christians just can't overcome on their own.
And that reinforces the idea that you need the outside money. So the huge amount of help didn't automatically translate into, self-replicating growth.
It raises big questions about what kind of support actually empowers local movements versus creating dependency.
Okay, so if that traditional model focused maybe too much on buildings and external funding isn't always sparking these CPMs, where are they happening?
Well, the sources suggest a really compelling pattern. These dynamic movements often seem to pop up where the normal way of doing church has been seriously disrupted.
Disrupted? How so?
Think about the contexts. Intense drug violence, like you see in parts of Colombia, or extreme geographical isolation, like some indigenous groups.
Or even, like you mentioned, government suppression, military regimes trying to stamp out religion.
Right. These situations, they hardly seem like ideal conditions for growth, do they?
Not at all.
But it seems they might have kind of cleared the ground, disrupted the status quo enough for new, maybe more adaptable approaches to take root.
Approaches that didn't rely on the old structures or the external funding model?
Precisely. Models that, as our sources show, might actually be better suited for these kinds of self-replicating movements.
Okay, let's get specific then. Let's talk about Colombia first. The picture painted there is just intense.
Yeah, extreme violence. The numbers are hard to even comprehend, like 70 deaths a day, 25,000 a year, 8 kidnappings daily.
It's just constant fear and instability. That kind of social breakdown, it inevitably tears apart traditional structures, right? Including religious ones.
Absolutely. And in that chaos, the traditional foreign missionary model faced huge risks. Foreigners, often seen as having money, were prime targets for kidnapping.
So it became dangerous for them to operate in the usual way. And what about the local churches? The buildings?
Many were destroyed, or they just became unsafe or impossible to get to. So believers had to find other ways to meet.
Like what?
Small groups, meeting in homes, on front porches. It was just 10 or 12 people gathering together informally. And here's the twist. In the midst of all that fear and disruption, something else happened.
Yeah.
An incredible openness to the gospel message. One town saw over 540 people decide to follow Christ in less than a month.
Wow. So the breakdown actually created a kind of spiritual vacuum.
It seems like it. A hunger that the old building-focused models couldn't easily meet anymore, which opened the door for these more agile, local ways of being church.
Almost like removing the old scaffolding allowed something new and maybe stronger to grow in its place.
That's a good way to put it. And this leads us to the International Charismatic Mission in Bogota, led by Pastor Cesar Castellanos.
Okay, so this is connected to that huge youth gathering we started with.
Yes, it is. Now, technically, it's one enormous church, not quite a decentralized network like some CPMs, but its internal structure has a lot in common with them.
How does that work?
They use a cell church model. It's built around what they call groups of 12, small relational groups.
And this model took off.
Exploded. They started with just 70 of these cell groups in 1983. 8 years later, over 20,000.
20,000 groups. How did they manage that kind of growth?
Well, Pastor Cesar was inspired by David Yoongi Cho's massive church in South Korea, but he adapted the model. The focus was on really rapid growth and making sure new believers got connected and mentored quickly within these small groups.
And the numbers show it worked. 8,000 members by 1990, then over 45,000 by 1999, meeting in a stadium using satellite centers.
It's incredible. But it wasn't just about the structure. The leadership really emphasized experiencing God, seeking his guidance.
And it was locally led.
Absolutely. Indigenous Colombian leaders at every level. Rapid replication of the cells was key, but so were core values like prayer, fasting, striving for holiness.
And this was all happening against that backdrop of terrible violence?
Yes, and it hit close to home. Pastor Cesar and his wife were actually shot in an attack in 1997. It's a stark reminder of the risks involved.
Yet the movement kept growing.
And continues to thrive. Those opening stats, 18,000 youth at worship, 500 commitments weekly, 8,000 youth cells, that speaks volumes about the lasting impact.
And there are similar stories, right? Like in El Salvador.
Yeah, Sergio Solorzano's Elim Christian Mission, again, more of a megachurch structure, but heavily reliant on cell groups. By 98, they had like 116,000 people attending over 5,000 cell groups. They needed hundreds of buses just to get people to the main services on Sunday.
So while maybe not pure house church movements in the strictest sense, these examples definitely show how that cell-based, decentralized approach can fuel massive growth and local involvement.
Definitely. Okay, so let's shift gears. A totally different kind of disruption. Extreme isolation. We need to talk about the Quechua people in northern Guatemala.
Okay, the Quechua. Who are they?
They're descendants of the Mayan people living in really remote areas, historically very hard to reach.
And their religious background.
For centuries, it was mostly a mix of Catholicism and their traditional Mayan beliefs. And because of the isolation, literacy was low, both in Spanish and even in their own Quechua language.
Sounds like a lot of barriers to introducing something new, like evangelical Christianity.
You'd think so. But between the 1960s and 1980s, the number of Quechua believers absolutely surged. It tripled, from around 20,000 to over 60,000.
Tripled? How did that happen?
Well, a missionary researcher named Frank Johnson looked into it and identified 6 key reasons. And they're really insightful.
All right, let's hear them. What's the first one?
First, there was a deliberate shift by missionaries to focus on the Quechua people directly using their language. Before that, efforts were mainly in Spanish.
Which probably felt foreign, maybe even like the language of conquerors.
Exactly. Johnson pointed out that for generations, if a Quechua person became Christian, it was in Spanish. Imagine hearing the core message in your own language for the first time.
That leads to the second point, I guess.
It does. The second factor was actually getting the Quechua Bible and other Christian materials translated and available in Quechua.
For God so loved the world, in your own mother tongue.
Powerful stuff. Johnson said nothing affirms a people's identity like having their own literature.
Makes sense. What's third?
Developing indigenous Quechua leadership. This was huge. Instead of bringing in trained pastors from outside, they raised up leaders from within the community.
So if most people were, say, illiterate farmers,
then their pastor might also be an illiterate farmer. It created a church that felt truly theirs.
Okay. Fourth factor.
This ties back to the isolation itself. Their remoteness actually protected them from well-meaning outside paternalism. It forced them to be self-reliant.
How so?
Get this. The first Kekchi leaders didn't even go to a national church meeting until 5 years after the missionary work started. They were just figuring things out on their own.
Wow. Okay, number 5.
Financial self-support. Because they were so isolated, they couldn't rely on a steady stream of money from foreign volunteers.
So they had to build their own churches.
Literally. Built by Kekchi people using local materials, it fostered real ownership, avoided that dependency trap we talked about earlier.
Right. And the last factor.
The Kekchi themselves developed a strong mission focus. They were taught right away that every church should plant other churches. They even had a saying.
What was it?
A church without a mission congregation is a dead church.
That's powerful. So this Kekchi growth happened even though Guatemala had established churches elsewhere.
Exactly. It really highlights how that isolation, that disruption of the norm, let them develop their own effective ways of growing without outside influence or money dictating things.
Okay, so we've seen violence and isolation. What's the third type of disruption?
Government suppression. This is a tough one. The source material deliberately doesn't name the country for safety reasons.
Understood. So what's the context?
Think of a place largely closed off to the world for decades. A one-party socialist state, limited freedoms, widespread poverty. But interestingly, high literacy.
And religion.
Historically overwhelmingly Catholic. But the government actively tried to suppress all religion for a long, long time.
A really difficult environment.
Extremely difficult. But again, we see extraordinary growth, especially among Baptists there. Missionaries had worked there for 75 years before a military coup.
And what happened then?
Many missionaries were jailed or kicked out. About half the Baptist members fled the country.
And the government clamped down harder.
Oh, yeah. Decades of trying to stamp out Christianity. Persecution, prison, even torture were common. The number of Baptists initially dropped, then very slowly started to recover.
But then something changed.
Around 1989, yes, a kind of spiritual awakening started in the Northern Baptist group. Much more prayer, evangelism, intentional church planting.
And it worked, under that pressure.
Amazingly, yes. By the late 90s, the North had over 14,000 baptized members in nearly 1,500 churches or house churches.
House churches mostly.
Vastly. Only about 160 were officially registered churches. Nearly 1,000 were meeting secretly in homes. And tens of thousands more were waiting to be baptized.
Incredible. Was it similar for the Southern Baptist group?
Very similar trend. By 2000, they had maybe only 70 registered buildings, but over 2,600 congregations in total, thanks to the explosion of house churches. Membership surged, thousands baptized each year, thousands more in Bible classes.
The total number of churches grew by, what was it, 1,900% in just one decade.
1,900%. Just astonishing growth under intense opposition.
So how? What made that possible? The sources must point to some reasons.
They do. Several key things. First, just decades of persistent prayer for the country. Believers there called themselves a people on their knees.
Okay, prayer. What else?
Ironically, the persecution itself. While terrible, it seemed to purify and strengthen the church. Remember that leader who called prison a second seminary?
Right. It forged leaders.
It really did. Many key leaders had spent time in prison or forced labor for their faith. Also, the groundwork laid by those early missionaries was vital.
How so?
Their emphasis on the priesthood of every believer. The idea that every Christian can minister, not just pastors. That empowered ordinary people.
Anything else?
Yeah, even during the isolation, gospel radio broadcasts in the local language kept getting through, sustaining people's faith.
And when missionaries could finally visit again in the early 90s.
Their approach was crucial. They focused on encouraging the house churches that were already starting, supporting local leaders, and being really careful not to create dependency on foreign aid.
Okay, and then there was that moment in 1992, the government official.
Ah, yes, a pivotal moment. The few existing church buildings were packed. Fuel shortages made travel hard. The Baptist leader kept asking the government for permission to build more churches.
And the government kept saying no.
Right. Finally, this one official, totally exasperated, just snaps. Buildings, buildings, buildings. Why don't you just meet in your homes?
He didn't mean it as helpful advice, I assume.
Probably not. But the Baptist leader heard it, took it seriously, and they made a strategic shift towards actively promoting house churches, casas cultos.
And that was the game changer.
Absolutely transformative. First, it freed the church from being tied to buildings, which the government was watching closely.
Made them less visible, more flexible.
Exactly.
Right.
Second, it created this huge need for lay leaders, which sparked a massive movement to train them up.
Because every house church needed someone to lead it.
Right. Third, starting a new church became super simple. Just find someone willing to open their home. Done.
Lowered the barrier significantly.
For sure. And it made it easier for people from non-Christian backgrounds, too. Less intimidating than a formal building. Plus, they could grow rapidly without attracting so much government attention.
And the people embraced it.
Wholeheartedly. Both Baptist groups set up training schools just for lay missionaries, sending out nearly 800 of them within the country.
Wow. And now this movement, born under persecution, might even send missionaries out.
Yeah, the potential is there for tent-maker missionaries, people supporting themselves financially while serving internationally.
Okay, so 3 very different stories. Colombia's violence, Guatemala's isolation, this unnamed country's suppression. When you pull back, what are the common threads? What are the big lessons here?
Well, a few things really stand out, don't they? First, that theme of disruption keeps coming up. Violence, isolation, persecution. They all broke the old molds and created space for something new.
Right, they forced adaptation.
Second, the absolute necessity of indigenous leadership. Movements led by locals, rooted in the local context, they're just far more resilient and effective.
Makes sense. What else?
Third, a reliance on God, not foreign money. When external funding wasn't available, or when it was deliberately avoided, it fostered self-reliance, ownership,
And the 4th thing.
adaptable structures,
Yeah.
especially the house church model in various forms. It just seems incredibly effective for rapid, sustainable growth in these kinds of challenging environments.
It really does starkly contrast with those traditional approaches we talked about at the start, the ones maybe too focused on buildings and outside funding.
Yeah, which, again, often came from a good place, but sometimes ended up creating dependency instead of empowerment.
The focus shifted, didn't it? From building structures to building communities of faith that could adapt and multiply on their own terms.
That's it, exactly. Communities that could thrive even when things got incredibly difficult.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what should you, our listener, take away from all this?
Well, hopefully it gives you a fresh look at how faith can grow in places and ways you might not expect, even in really tough situations.
It's definitely a testament to the power of local leadership, isn't it? And the resilience that comes from real community facing adversity together.
And it highlights that crucial difference between just giving aid and actually empowering people to stand on their own feet.
And maybe it leaves you with a question to think about.
Yeah, what are the conventional norms in your own life or your community or maybe your work? Are there things you take for granted that might actually be holding back growth or new kinds of connection?
What could happen if those norms got disrupted, even in small ways? It makes you think, doesn't it? About what really drives connection, resilience, and growth in any group or movement you care about.